The aircraft skin is 800 degrees Fahrenheit. The fuel, a substance so inert you can stub a cigarette out in it. The cockpit is a metal blister at the edge of space. The pilot, sealed in a pressure suit, watches the altimeter tick past 70,000 feet. At this height, the sky is not blue, it is indigo. The curvature of the Earth is visible below. The throttles are at military power. Then the pilot pushes them forward into afterburner. Two J-58 engines gulp 1,000 gallons of fuel per minute. The airframe shudders. The Mach meter climbs through 2.5, then 2.8, then 3. 3 times the speed of sound. Faster than a rifle bullet. Faster than any fighter that could chase it. At altitude, the physics of intercept were almost impossible. The Blackbird was untouchable. But untouchable did not mean unstoppable. Because the thing that would ground this aircraft had nothing to do with enemy missiles. It had to do with decisions made in quiet rooms thousands of miles from the sky. This is the story of an aircraft built for a war it was never allowed to fight, and how the fastest air-breathing plane ever made became a museum piece while its enemies still flew. To understand why the SR-71 Blackbird was both a miracle and a paradox, you have to understand the day the previous miracle died. May 1st, 1960. A Lockheed U-2 spy plane piloted by Francis Gary Powers is crossing the Soviet Union at 70,000 feet. The CIA has been flying these missions for 4 years. The U-2 is a glider with a jet engine, fragile and slow but able to cruise above Soviet air defenses. Or so the Americans believe. On this day, a new Soviet surface-to-air missile, the SA-2 guideline, reaches higher than expected. A salvo of missiles detonates near Powers' aircraft. The shockwave snaps the tail. Powers falls from the edge of space. He survives. He is captured. The photographs of his aircraft wreckage are paraded before the world. The Soviet Union demands an apology. President Eisenhower is forced to admit the United States has been spying. He publicly suspends all overflights of Soviet territory. The embarrassment is total. But the intelligence need does not vanish. The CIA still needs to know where Soviet bombers are, where missiles are being deployed, what is happening behind the Iron Curtain. They need a new aircraft. They need something that cannot be shot down. The task falls to Clarence Kelly Johnson. Johnson runs Lockheed's Advanced Development Projects, a secretive division known as the Skunk Works. Johnson's Skunk Works works on the same principle. Small team, no bureaucracy, rapid results. They built the U-2 in 9 months. Now Johnson is asked to build its replacement. The specifications are almost absurd. The aircraft must fly above 80,000 feet. It must exceed Mach 3. It must carry a camera capable of resolving a 2-foot object from the stratosphere. It must be invisible to radar, or as close to invisible as possible. Johnson begins work in 1960. The project is code-named Oxcart. The aircraft will be designated A-12. The A stands for Archangel. The 12 is the 12th design iteration. The earlier iterations are filed in Johnson's drawer. Some look like delta-winged arrows, some look like bats. The final design looks like a stiletto blade, a long, razor-sharp fuselage with 2 enormous engines embedded in the wings. The leading edges of the wings are serrated with corrugations, a feature Johnson calls bellows, which allow the skin to expand when heated. The entire aircraft will be built from titanium. Titanium was not a casual choice. It is a metal that barely existed in the Western world in useful quantities. The Soviet Union, ironically, was the largest producer. The CIA set up front companies to purchase Soviet titanium through intermediaries in third countries. It was a quiet piece of espionage, entirely separate from the aircraft itself. The material for the ultimate spy plane was bought from the enemy. The titanium arrived in the United States in small batches, often shipped to fictitious addresses, then trucked to Lockheed's Burbank facility. The metallurgy alone was a nightmare. Titanium is brittle if machined at the wrong temperature. Cadmium-plated tools, commonly used in aerospace, embrittle titanium on contact. Lockheed had to strip its entire tooling inventory of cadmium and replace it with alternative coatings. The learning curve was brutal. Whole sections of the first airframe cracked during fabrication and had to be scrapped. Welding titanium required an inert argon atmosphere. The welders worked inside sealed chambers, manipulating the metal through gloves. It was less like building an airplane and more like performing surgery inside a controlled environment chamber. The Skunk Works was not just designing an aircraft. It was inventing the industrial processes to build it. Every step was a frontier. Then there was the fuel problem. At Mach 3, the aircraft skin becomes a furnace. Ordinary jet fuel would boil in the tanks, or worse, ignite spontaneously. The solution was a unique hydrocarbon blend called JP7. Its flash point is so high you can drop a lit match into a bucket and the match goes out. This safety came with a price. JP7 is almost impossible to ignite with conventional spark plugs, so every engine start required a shot of triethylborane, a pyrophoric chemical that ignites on contact with air. The result was a green flash and a puff of white smoke, a tiny firework that marked the beginning of every flight. Ground crews had to wear full fire suits just to be near the aircraft during engine start. The triethylborane was stored in a small tank on the aircraft, enough for 16 starts. If the engines flamed out in flight, and they sometimes did, the pilot had to use the chemical to relight them before the aircraft dropped below its minimum altitude. If the relight failed, the sled became a glider, and not a good one. The Blackbird's glide ratio was approximately 1:7, meaning for every mile of altitude it lost, it could travel 7 miles forward. A pilot with a flameout at 80,000 feet had roughly 15 minutes to find a place to land. In practice, pilots relit the engines. They always relit them. They had no alternative. The cockpit itself was an environment only barely connected to Earth. The pressure suit worn by the pilot was built by the same company that later produced space shuttle suits, the David Clark Company. It inflated to prevent blood from boiling if cabin pressure failed at altitude. The helmet locked into a neck ring with a metallic click. The pilot breathed pure oxygen for an hour before flight to purge nitrogen from the bloodstream, preventing decompression sickness. The cockpit windows were thick panels of quartz glass composite, fused to the frame to withstand the heat. At cruise, the windshield reached 600 degrees. The pilot could feel the warmth through his gloved fingers if he touched the canopy frame. There was no ejection seat that could operate at Mach 3 without killing the pilot. The ejection procedure called for slowing down and descending first. If something went catastrophically wrong at speed, the pilot was simply along for the ride. The first A-12 attempted to take to the air on April 25, 1962, from a secret base in Nevada known as Groom Lake, Area 51. Test pilot Louis Schalk was conducting a high-speed taxi test on the dry lakebed when the aircraft unexpectedly lifted off the ground for a short hop. It was not planned. The aircraft was not yet ready for flight, but the moment proved the machine wanted to fly. The next day, April 26th, Schalk took the A-12 into the sky for its first official, deliberate flight. He immediately knew he was flying something unlike any machine in history. The aircraft was unstable, leaking fuel from every seam. The titanium panels had not yet thermally expanded to seal themselves. The flight lasted only a few minutes, ending with the aircraft trailing a white vapor plume visible for miles. The test program was a series of controlled emergencies. Flights pushed the envelope in small increments. The Mach meter crawled upward, 1.5, 2.0, 2.5. At each step, new problems emerged. The engine inlets, which used a complex system of movable spikes to manage supersonic airflow, were finicky. An inlet unstart, a sudden disruption of the shock wave at the engine entrance, could throw the aircraft into a violent yaw, slamming the pilot's helmet against the canopy. Pilots learned to anticipate the unstart by feel, by a subtle change in vibration, and correct it with throttle before the aircraft snapped. They became extensions of the machine, or the machine became an extension of them. In January 1965, the A-12 reached its design speed, Mach 3.29, a record for the type. The pilots reported the experience was not like flying an airplane. It was like riding a beam of light. The sky was black at altitude. The stars were visible at noon. The aircraft was so fast that if a Soviet missile was launched from directly below, the Blackbird could simply accelerate and pull away before the missile could climb to intercept. The physics were punishing. An SA-2 missile could reach Mach 3.5, but it had to climb 60,000 feet. The Blackbird, already at Mach 3 and covering 25 miles per minute, would be long gone by the time the missile arrived. The missile climbed to where the aircraft was, not where it was going. And by the time it got there, the aircraft was gone. The math was unforgiving. Speed is survival. But even as the aircraft proved itself, the world was changing. In 1963, the United States and the Soviet Union signed the Limited Test Ban Treaty. In 1964, the first reconnaissance satellite, Corona, became operational. Satellites can photograph Soviet territory from orbit, and unlike aircraft, they do not violate national airspace. The legal argument was settled. Overflights of sovereign territory are acts of war if done without permission. The U-2 had already caused one diplomatic crisis. The A-12 would be an even greater provocation. In 1964, President Lyndon Johnson was briefed on the A-12. He was told it could fly over the Soviet Union with near impunity. He was also told that if one were shot down, the consequences would be catastrophic. The pilot would be captured. The technology would be compromised. The international backlash would isolate the United States. Johnson made a decision. No manned overflight of the Soviet Union would ever be authorized again. The A-12 would not be allowed to fly over the country it was designed to penetrate. The fastest aircraft in history was now looking for a mission. The decision was not made lightly, but it was made firmly. The White House convened a special panel, the President's Foreign Intelligence Advisory Board, to weigh the risks. Some members argued that the intelligence value of a Soviet overflight outweighed the diplomatic damage. Others pointed out that the Soviet Union, humiliated by the powers incident, had made it clear that any future overflight would be treated as an act of war. Premier Nikita Khrushchev had personally warned that Soviet air defenses had been improved, that the SA-2 was now deployed in rings around key cities, and that the Soviet Union would not tolerate another incursion. The panel's final recommendation was cautious. Use the A-12 for peripheral missions, but do not cross the border. Johnson accepted the recommendation. The order went out. The Blackbird was banned from the heartland of its enemy before it had ever crossed the line. The solution, for a time, was peripheral reconnaissance. The A-12 could fly along the borders of the Soviet Union, China, and North Korea, using side-looking cameras to peer inward without crossing the line. These missions, codenamed Operation Black Shield, began in 1967. The aircraft was based at Kadena Air Base in Okinawa, Japan. From there, it could reach the Korean Peninsula, the Chinese coast, and the Soviet Far East in minutes. The first operational sortie flew on May 31, 1967, over North Vietnam. The A-12 photographed surface-to-air missile sites, radar installations, and troop concentrations. It returned with images so sharp analysts could identify individual vehicles. The North Vietnamese fired missiles. None came close. The aircraft was too fast. The missions continued through 1968. The A-12 was never touched. But the political calculus was already shifting again. The Air Force had its own version of the aircraft, the SR-71. The SR stood for Strategic Reconnaissance. It was slightly heavier, slightly slower, but carried more sensors. The Air Force and the CIA were duplicating capabilities. The budget was stretched. In 1968, the A-12 program was canceled. The aircraft had flown a total of 29 operational sorties. The remaining airframes were flown to Palmdale, California, and placed in storage. Some would later be cut into pieces. The SR-71 became the sole Blackbird. The SR-71 entered service in 1966, even before the A-12 was retired. Its first operational base was at Beale Air Force Base in California. The crews were hand-picked. The physical requirements were brutal. A pilot had to be between 25 and 40 years old. Married, the Air Force believed married men were more stable and emotionally unflappable. He had to pass a spaceflight physical because the cockpit environment was closer to a spacecraft than an airplane. The pressure suit alone weighed 35 pounds. The helmet locked into a neck ring. The suit inflated to prevent blood boiling at altitude. The pilots ate a high-protein, low-residue meal before flight, steak and eggs, no toast, because there was no toilet on the aircraft. The missions lasted 4 to 8 hours, most of it spent at supersonic speeds. The pilots learned to urinate into a special bag, a procedure that was never elegant. They were told that if the cockpit pressurization failed at altitude, their blood would literally boil. They were told the aircraft leaked fuel on the ground because the titanium panels did not seal until they expanded at speed. They were told the engines could flame out at any moment. They were told the autopilot could fail, requiring them to hand-fly an unstable aircraft at Mach 3 for hours. They accepted all of this. They wore the silver suit. They flew. The SR-71's operational career was defined not by what it was built for, but by what it was allowed to do. It flew over North Vietnam throughout the war, photographing prisoner-of-war camps, supply routes, and air defenses. In 1972, an S-71 photographed the infamous Hanoi Hilton prison, confirming the locations of American POWs. The images were used by negotiators at the Paris peace talks. The North Vietnamese fired hundreds of missiles at the Blackbird. Over the course of the war, none hit. The standard evasion procedure was simple. Push the throttles forward. The missile fell behind, ran out of fuel, and tumbled to Earth. The pilots did not even see them. They were told later, by the debriefers, that a missile had been launched. The information was almost an afterthought. The Blackbird's operational tempo was relentless. A typical mission from Kadena began with a pre-dawn briefing. The crew ate their steak and eggs in silence. They suited up with the help of life support technicians who pulled the neck ring tight and checked the oxygen seals. The aircraft, having leaked fuel all night onto the hangar floor, was towed out and topped off just before engine start. The triethylborane flash, the spinning up of the J-58s, the taxi to the runway, all of it was ritual. The takeoff was a controlled explosion. The afterburners lit, and the sled accelerated down the runway, rotating at a speed that would make a fighter pilot wince. Once airborne, the Blackbird climbed rapidly to refueling altitude. A tanker was waiting over the Pacific, a KC-135 loaded with JP-7. The Blackbird took on a full load of fuel, sometimes over 100,000 pounds, then lit the afterburners again and climbed through the stratosphere. The refueling was the most dangerous part of the mission, not because of enemy action but because of the sheer difficulty of mating two large aircraft in flight. The Blackbird had to slow down to the tanker's speed, and its engines were not efficient at subsonic speeds. The aircraft burned fuel so fast during refueling that the crew called it making a hole in the sky. After refueling, the real mission began. The pilot pushed the throttles into afterburner and held them there. The aircraft accelerated through Mach 1, Mach 2, Mach 3. The cockpit grew quiet as the shock waves moved behind the cockpit, leaving the crew in a bubble of subsonic air. The outside temperature indicator dropped to -60 degrees Fahrenheit. But the skin of the aircraft was 600 degrees and climbing. The windshield heated to the point where it could blister a bare hand instantly. The crew monitored the systems, checked the cameras, watched the fuel state. The autopilot held the aircraft steady. Occasionally, an engine unstart would jolt them. The pilot would correct it and continue. The hours passed in a strange, detached silence. Some pilots described it as the closest thing to meditation a combat aircraft could offer. Then, at the designated point, the cameras began their work. The optical bar camera, a rotating lens system that swept side to side, captured a continuous strip image of the ground below. The resolution was so high that from 80,000 feet, the camera could read the numbers on a ship's deck. The film, once developed, filled miles of acetate reels. Analysts pored over every frame. Nothing escaped the Blackbird's eye. In October 1973, the Yom Kippur War erupted. Israel was attacked by Egypt and Syria. The United States needed intelligence on the battlefield immediately. An SR-71 was dispatched from Beale to the Middle East. The aircraft flew a round trip of over 12,000 miles, refueled multiple times by tanker aircraft. It crossed the Mediterranean, entered the Sinai, photographed the entire battle area, and landed in England. The film was developed and flown to Washington. In record time, the imagery was in the hands of President Nixon, showing the precise positions of Egyptian and Israeli forces. The intelligence allowed the United States to negotiate a ceasefire from a position of knowledge. The Blackbird had become a tool of diplomacy. It was not just a spy plane. It was a strategic asset that could shift the balance of a war without firing a shot. But even as it proved its worth, the aircraft's future was being questioned. The 1970s brought a new generation of spy satellites. The KH-11 Kennan satellite, launched in 1976, could transmit digital imagery in real time. It did not need film. It did not need a pilot. It did not provoke international incidents. The satellite lobby in the Pentagon argued that the SR-71 was redundant. The aircraft community argued that satellites were predictable. An enemy could hide sensitive activity when the satellite passed overhead, a practice called denial and deception. The Blackbird arrived unannounced. It could photograph a target from an oblique angle, something a satellite cannot do. It could be retasked in hours, while a satellite's orbit is fixed. The debate became a bureaucratic war. The budget analysts sharpened their pencils. The cost of the SR-71 was not small. The operating budget ran approximately $300 million per year, a figure that included the tanker fleet, the special fuel, the maintenance crews, the base infrastructure. But the cost debate masked a deeper institutional struggle. The Air Force was dominated by bomber generals who had come up through Strategic Air Command. Their vision of air power revolved around bombers, the B-52, the B-1, the B-2. Reconnaissance was a supporting function, not a core mission. The SR-71 units were small, elite, and isolated. They had no powerful patrons in the Pentagon. The National Reconnaissance Office, which ran the satellite programs, guarded its budget fiercely and saw the Blackbird as a competitor for resources. The SR-71 was caught between two bureaucracies, neither of which wanted to pay for it. The aircraft's performance was not in question. Its political survival was. In 1989, the Air Force announced the SR-71 would be retired. The date was set for January 1990. The pilots were stunned. The aircraft was still flying missions. It was still untouchable. But the decision was made. The Blackbird would be grounded. The official rationale was that satellites and the U-2 could cover the reconnaissance mission more cheaply. The unspoken rationale was that the Air Force needed the money for the B-2 bomber program, which was over budget and behind schedule. The Blackbird was sacrificed on the altar of budget priorities. The pilots, trained to confront enemy missiles, found themselves powerless against spreadsheets. Then in August 1990, Iraq invaded Kuwait. The SR-71 was temporarily reactivated. It flew missions over the Middle East, mapping Iraqi positions for Operation Desert Shield. The aircraft performed flawlessly. The advocates made their case. See, the Blackbird is still needed. The Air Force ignored them. The retirement proceeded. On January 26, 1990, the last operational SR-71 flight of that era landed at Beale Air Force Base. The aircraft was taxied into a hangar. The engines were shut down for what was supposed to be the final time. The pilots turned in their pressure suits. The ground crew drained the JP-7. The fastest air-breathing aircraft in the world was now a static display. But the story did not end. In the mid-1990s, the United States found itself without adequate reconnaissance over potential hotspots. Satellites were limited by their orbits. The U-2 was vulnerable to improved air defenses. In 1995, Congress, led by Senator John Glenn, a former astronaut who understood the value of high-speed reconnaissance, pushed for the SR-71's reactivation. The Air Force, reluctantly, complied. 3 airframes were pulled from storage in Palmdale. The aircraft were refurbished. New digital sensors were installed alongside the old film cameras. The crews were retrained. Some of the original pilots, now in their 40s and 50s, came back to teach a new generation. In 1995, the Blackbird flew again. It was an astonishing resurrection, a machine from the 1960s returning to service in the age of the internet. The reactivated aircraft flew missions over North Korea, monitoring nuclear sites. They flew over the Balkans, mapping mass graves during the Yugoslav wars. They flew over the Middle East again, watching Saddam Hussein's movements during the no-fly zone enforcement. The aircraft was still the fastest thing in the sky. The new pilots experienced the same indigo sky and the same silent ride above the stratosphere. The knowledge was passed down like scripture, but the political battle was not over. In 1997, President Bill Clinton used a line-item veto to cut the SR-71's funding from the defense budget. The Air Force leadership, which had never loved the program, did not fight. The satellites had won again. The Blackbird was grounded a second time. In 1998, the final operational flight took place. The aircraft was flown to the Smithsonian National Air and Space Museum's Stephen F. Udvar-Hazy Center near Dulles International Airport. It landed on the runway at Dulles, coasting to a stop before a crowd of onlookers. The pilot shut down the engines. The aircraft was towed into the museum. It sits now in the Boeing aviation hangar, suspended from the ceiling. Children walk under it. They point. They ask what it is. Their parents do not always know. The aircraft that was built to photograph Soviet missile silos never did. Not once. The A-12 and the SR-71 between them flew thousands of missions. They photographed Vietnam, the Middle East, North Korea, China's periphery, Cuba, Nicaragua, Libya. But the Soviet heartland, the reason the titanium was smuggled and the quartz windshields were forged, remained off-limits for direct overflight. The Blackbird was a sword that was never drawn in anger against its intended enemy. The politicians decided the risk was too great. They were wrong, but they were wrong after the decision was made. And by the time anyone admitted the mistake, the production line was cold. The tooling was destroyed. The engineers were retired or dead. The knowledge of how to build a Blackbird, the institutional memory of the Skunk works in its 1960s prime, was gone. There is a phrase the pilots used, the sled. They called the SR-71 the sled because it rode on top of its own power, barely under control, always on the edge. The sled was a feeling as much as a machine. It was the sensation of acceleration when the afterburners lit, the push into the seat that did not stop, the altimeter unwinding faster than the brain could process. The sled was the silence at altitude, the thin hiss of oxygen in the helmet, the knowledge that you were alone above every other living thing. The pilots who flew the sled spoke of it the way sailors speak of the sea. The political decisions that grounded the Blackbird were made by men who never flew it. They were men who looked at charts, at budget lines, at diplomatic cables. They weighed the aircraft's cost against its provocation and found the provocation too heavy. They were not wrong about the provocation. An overflight of the Soviet Union in 1970 would have been an act of war. A pilot shot down over Siberia would have been a crisis beyond the U-2. The decision to keep the Blackbird on the periphery was defensible. What was less defensible was the failure to build a successor, the failure to invest in the next speed, the next altitude, the next technology that could have rendered the provocation moot. The Blackbird was retired without a replacement. The United States still flies reconnaissance, but it flies slower, it flies lower. It flies drones that can be jammed and satellites that can be tracked. The speed of the Blackbird, the simple physics of Mach 3 survival, has no equivalent in the current inventory. There are rumors of a new aircraft, a hypersonic successor, a son of Blackbird. The SR-72, some call it. The Pentagon does not confirm or deny. But the rumors are persistent. They suggest that someone somewhere has learned the lesson of the sled. That speed is not a luxury. Speed is survival. On one mission near the Kamchatka Peninsula, a Soviet MiG-25 was scrambled to intercept an SR-71. The MiG-25 was the fastest interceptor in the Soviet inventory, capable of Mach 2.8 in short bursts. It was the only aircraft that could even approach the Blackbird's performance. The MiG pilot locked his radar on the SR-71. The Blackbird's defensive systems operator saw the threat. The pilot pushed the throttles forward. The Mach meter climbed past 3. The MiG fell behind, ran out of fuel, and turned back. The Blackbird completed its mission. The encounter was logged and forgotten. But it was representative of dozens of such attempts. The sled was simply too fast. The pilots were not cavalier about the danger. They knew that a single mechanical failure at Mach 3 could be fatal. They knew that the titanium skin, if it cracked, could tear the aircraft apart in seconds. They knew that the pressure suit, if it failed, would leave them conscious for perhaps 15 seconds before their blood boiled. They flew anyway. They flew because the mission required it, and because they were among the few human beings on Earth who could. The selection process was so rigorous that out of every 1,000 applicants, perhaps one became an SR-71 pilot. They were the absolute elite, and they knew it. They wore the silver suit with pride. They walked to the aircraft with a calm that was not fake. They had been trained to trust the machine, and they trusted it completely. The camaraderie among the crews was intense. The pilot and the reconnaissance systems officer, the RSO, spent hours together in the cockpit, their lives dependent on each other's skill. The RSO managed the sensors, the electronic countermeasures, the navigation systems. He was the eyes of the aircraft, the pilot the hands. They communicated with brief, professional phrases. They learned to read each other's silences. After the missions, they debriefed together, then ate together, then slept. The next mission was always coming. The pace was punishing, but it was the life they had chosen, and none of them would have chosen differently. Now the sled hangs from a ceiling. The titanium is cool to the touch. The quartz windows are dusty. The engines are silent. The fuel that could not be lit by a match is gone. The pilots who flew it are old men now. Some have died. The ones who remain gather at reunions. They tell stories about the time the engine flamed out over Laos, about the time the autopilot failed over the Arctic, about the time they saw the aurora borealis from 80,000 feet and the sky was on fire. They tell the stories, and the stories are all that is left. The Blackbird that disappeared before its first real mission did not disappear. It was taken. It was taken by men in quiet rooms who weighed the cost of a crisis against the cost of not knowing. They made their choice. They grounded the sled. And for the rest of the Cold War, the Soviet missile silos, the submarine bases, the secret cities, remained unphotographed from directly above by the aircraft that was built to see them. The satellites photographed them, but the satellites did not surprise them. The enemy knew when the satellites were coming. They covered their tracks. The Blackbird would not have given them time. But the Blackbird never came. The question of whether that choice was right is still debated. Some intelligence officers say the satellite imagery was good enough. Some say the missing data would not have changed the strategic balance. Some say the risk of a captured pilot was simply too great. All of these arguments are reasonable, and all of them are incomplete, because the real cost of grounding the Blackbird was not the loss of imagery. It was the loss of a capability that went far beyond photography. The Blackbird was not just a spy plane. It was a statement. It was the physical proof that American technology could operate where no other nation could follow. It was a deterrent of a different kind. Every time a Soviet general saw the contrail of a Blackbird crossing the periphery, he knew that the border was not a barrier, that the sky above his country was not closed, that the fastest air-breathing aircraft in the world was watching. And then, one day, it was not. The last Blackbird to fly operationally, tail number 617972, sits in the Udvar Hazy Center. You can walk under it. You can read the plaque. The plaque says it flew 2,801 hours. It says it was the fastest air-breathing aircraft ever built. It does not say what it was built for. It does not say what it was not allowed to do. The plaque is a fact sheet. The aircraft is a tombstone, the tombstone of a mission that never happened. But the knowledge is not entirely lost. The Skunk work still exists. The J-58 engine blueprints are still stored in a vault somewhere. The titanium supply chain is more accessible now. The computers are faster. The new generation of engineers has read the old manuals. They know what Kelly Johnson knew. They know that speed is survival. They know that the sky above 80,000 feet is still empty. They know that the politicians may change their minds again. The sled may fly once more. Until then, the Blackbird hangs in the museum, waiting for a mission it will never receive. And the men who flew it remember the indigo sky, the silent ride, and the question they were never allowed to answer. What would it have been like to fly over the Soviet Union at Mach 3, with nothing above them but the stars? They do not know. They will never know. The Blackbird disappeared before its first real mission, and the mission disappeared with it. The decision room is empty now. The men who made the choice are dead. The satellites they bet on are themselves obsolete, replaced by new satellites, which will one day be replaced by others. The cycle continues, but the Blackbird remains unique. A machine so far ahead of its time that its time never came. A machine built for a war that was already being fought by other means. A machine that proved its worth in every conflict except the one it was designed for. And tragedy is not a thing that can be fixed by building a faster plane. It can only be remembered. The Blackbird is remembered. Every child who walks under that aircraft and asks what it is remembering without knowing it. The memory is alive. The sled is still in the mind. And somewhere, in a hangar in Nevada, the next sled may already be taking shape. The engineers are not talking. The politicians are not asking. But the work continues. Speed is survival, and survival is not yet obsolete.